that all of us are now well acquainted with interdisciplinary research, whether we know the nuances of interdisciplinary research or we don't know the nuances, but somehow the way we are doing the research these days, it is satisfying the characteristics of interdisciplinary research, I would put it this way. Because these days our research is not oriented towards only to understand what lawmakers intend to do, what we call it in research jargon, law as such, or we generally also try to understand in terms of what is the whole purpose of law. Nowadays, we go beyond that investigation, and we also look at how the law operates and satisfying the goals for which it has been enacted. What we call this as law in action. So if you look at our research these days, you'd find that we have been doing this research. We have been somewhere giving this flavor in all our papers, what we write, or kind of project work, what we take. So interdisciplinary research, as I said, is now very much an accepted currency in legal research. There is no more a new phenomena. And obviously, we need to kind of make a distinction from the other two well-known terminologies which also influence the research in general. That is multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. In fact, there's a third one also, what we call it as cross-disciplinarity. So the overall theme of this FDP is interdisciplinary, and in that regard, I would be discussing on relevance of literature review. Now, before I come to that, I want to just give a perspective to the colleagues who are participating in this FDP, and I just want them to give a thought process on it and how do they see the interdisciplinary research progressing. So shall we look at interdisciplinary only from the perspective of law versus other disciplines? Shall we consider law as one coherent and integrated discipline? Or now law has developed in such a way that there are independent disciplines which have emerged also within law. So can that research be also called as interdisciplinary research? For example, the way we have been talking about the issue of public interest in patent law. Now, patent law is primarily a private law, as we understand, where it confers exclusive right to the patentee. But then there is a discussion going on that whether, while applying the law, there is a kind of responsibility to bring in the element of public interest. So is it a case of interdisciplinary research, or is it purely a disciplinary research where we are just talking about law? So this kind of questions are always there. This kind of questions are always there, which we need to also as a faculty investigate and to deliberate that whether this kind of research would also fall under the category of interdisciplinarity. Or for example, the cases which the Supreme Court decides, where Supreme Court gives a sort of emphasis on technology. No, for example, all of us have read the famous MC Mehta case, where MC Mehta in the Supreme Court has in one stroke implemented CNG in public transport in Delhi. So can we say that when we analyze those kind of cases, it is a sort of affirmation of technological affirmation by the judiciary, through the judicial process? So can that kind of research be also called as interdisciplinary research? Or the way we have been talking about, horizontal application of rights under Article 12, whether when we say that rights are also to be made applicable against private individuals. So are we again talking about interdisciplinary research? So these are the instances which I am just throwing, which I am just bringing it to notice to make a kind of understanding that how and to what in what manner we are taking up the interdisciplinary research. And to me, I would put it that it is more of uh, the law has developed, the discipline has developed in such a way that even now individual within the law, individual subjects have acquired the status of standalone discipline. I would put it this way. And instances are when you look at the way courses are being developed in different law schools, higher education institutions which are dealing with law in India. So, so that is also something which is giving a kind of newer dimension to legal research, where discipline need not be interdisciplinary, it need not be seen from law and others. It can be also within law. Uh, I leave it for you to deliberate and discuss and investigate this matter. Now, coming to the topic which I thought of discussing with you in this session is the relevance of uh, literature review. Now, what is the relevance of literature review? I mean, we have been seeing literature review as one of the inevitable or indispensable, part of the legal research. So generally, what we find is that when you talk about thesis, when you talk about the project, a research project, it has generally been seen as a kind of comprehensive knowledge on a specific subject matter. So, in order to ensure that the knowledge which has been uh, structured, which has been made is comprehensive, it is important to understand that whether the earlier research was taken into account or not. This is something which gives that affirmation to newness of your research, and that's why literature review becomes very important. Because when we say that my research is new, it is contributing in one or the other way, then it can be established only when I have undertaken a thorough literature review. And when it comes to law, you'd agree with me that in law, basically it is about understanding the historical aspects of the statutory provision, then to understand that how law has been made applicable, or how the judicial pronouncements have been dealing with that law. So there are different kinds of review, literature review. One is simple one, where we simply give a kind of overview of the topic, and which we did not get into a kind of detail what we see in academic approach. So simple review, I would put it, this is something which we undertake at the start of the research process. For example, we make up our mind that in which area we have to undertake the research, and in that regard we simply glance through the literature, simple review. Then we also the another category is what we call as applied review. In applied review in applied review, what we see is that in applied review, how the subject matter has interacted with other discipline, that how other discipline has been using is getting a kind of feel from the area on which you intend to do the research. And third one is academic, which we are well acquainted with and we have been doing in our research work, which is a kind of standalone work, which is about thoroughness, which is about quality, which is about which is about comprehensiveness. So this is something which is now a kind of focus for today's discussion. Now, what is the relevance? How we look at the relevance of literature review? See, no research is complete, or I'd put it that research is incomplete if it is not built on existing data. So the essential structural element of the research is a kind of architectural plan which has been thoughtfully planned from the beginning. So literature review ensures that. Literature review in a way ensures that homework is done properly. This is what is the relevance. This is what it kind of guarantees, that very vigilantly homework has been done, and it also familiarizes the researcher with the extent of data available in the field which researcher has adopted to work on. So literature review establishes a kind of in-depth understanding and data of the subject on which the researcher decides to undertake research. And why it is important, why that should be a thorough one, why there should be in-depth understanding, why there should be a proper familiarizing, I would put it in this way. This is to give the credibility to the work. This is important, that as a researcher, I must be a sort of self-confident that my work is my own work. So in order to get that feel of ownership, it is important to have a thorough review, because that thorough review will give credibility to this very point, that I am the author of the research for what I have undertaken. So that's what I consider as a very important point. And also literature review helps in establishing the consistency in information and connection on what has already been done on the area which you have been doing. Because there has to be a sort of, when you say, when we write a research proposal, we say that it will add a sort of new dimension to the existing knowledge base. These are kind of expressions when we use. So how do we establish that? Unless and until there is a connecting thread, and that connecting thread gets established only through literature review. So there has to be a consistency in information, and there has to be a connection with old materials. So what is there is that in literature review, primarily, there is an attempt to identify gaps within the information which is available in that matter. So literature review aims to that particular point. It aims to identify the gap, because it is the identification of the gap, and my suggestion to fulfill that gap is making my research a new one. It is that research which is going to give credentials to my work. And that's why it says that literature review needs to culminated in identifying the gaps. Now gaps need not be always in terms of vacuum. Generally, I mean, as a researcher, we think, okay, there is some deficiency we need to find out. Need not be. It need not be always in form of deficiency. It can be also in the form of an error which has not been traced till date. I'll give you an example which relates to part 13 of the Indian Constitution, freedom of trade. Now, way back in 1962, the Supreme Court has given an idea in Atiyabari about compensatory tax. 2015-16 in Jindal Stainless, the court says, oh, this tax, there is no jurisprudential or constitutional basis of this. So this is also about identifying error. It may not be always about the gap. So now when you undertake the research on this, that how judiciary has interpreted the idea of free trade all along, perhaps the research would go in the direction of, the review would go in the direction of identifying the error. So it need not be always a gap. Or I would put it in this way, that it is also about bringing in new interpretation. Your research can bring in a new interpretation. So literature review can also focus on this aspect, that what interpretation has been given, so that your research can very well suggest a newer interpretation. And that's why it is suggested that for literature review, what is important is that there has to be scientific and systematic study of the existing information. And there where we make a distinction from literature survey and literature review. Literature survey is all about giving a glance. Literature survey would not satisfy the criteria of systematic and scientific review, scientific study. So literature review warrants that there has to be a scientific and systematic study, which is all about scrutinizing the existing information. So, what is the key factor? The key factor is that literature review facilitates in distinguishing your study with the study done by others. So if you do a thorough research, this is something which is important to identify, important to mark, that this is something which very clearly establishes that how my research is different from other research. Generally, as a legal researcher, we come across with this we come across with this challenges, that what is new what we are doing. If we do a thorough research, that question will be addressed with very convenience and with ease. And moving further, how do we see literature review in research? And we be it research related to discipline or interdiscipline or transdiscipline, whatever it may be, that literature review describes the proposed research, that how it relates to prior research which has already been taken up. So it gives a kind of setup in that regard. And notably, I would say that it also shows originality in your research. So please do understand that literature review is also relevant in order to establish the point that how my research is original and how my research is relevant. Because generally this question we confront: is this research relevant? Should there be any taker of this research? Literature review would help you in establishing the same. Generally, this kind of questions we confront when we start doing the research. I would put it that if you do a thorough literature review, these questions will get addressed right at the beginning, and it will give you a different kind of confidence in carrying out the research. Another important contribution of good literature review is it also helps you in designing methodology. What kind of methodology you would be adopting for doing the research is also something connected with good literature review. For example, while doing a literature review, we find that good law has been made to address domestic violence, but then the the instances of domestic violence is on rise, then automatically it will take you to this point that this research needs to be done in interdisciplinary manner. Why? Because we need to also understand that why the law is not effective on ground. So this aspect, if you do a good literature review, it also helps you, it also justifies the methodology what you have adopted. So good literature review guarantees professionalism in your approach. And as a researcher, we need to be very professional. Generally, we say this, that as a researcher, I can be biased. I can have my own thought process on a topic which I have taken. That is not that is something which is not wrong. But methodology should not be biased. So there where the professionalism comes in. That I can be biased on certain aspect, but methodology should not be biased, because if methodology is biased, then perhaps I'll ensure that I arrive at the result which I have thought in our mind before starting the research. So review also satisfies the professional approach which is needed to carry on research. And believe me, if review is poor, then for sure the research will get affected. Now, when I say review, what does it mean? Is it all about simply summarizing what has been said by authors on the topic on which I am trying to do research? Answer is no. It is about engaging in a dialogue with the researchers who have already done researchers which have already done the work in that area. It is about I, as a researcher, getting an opportunity to engage in a kind of written dialogue with the researchers in my area. And to show this, that my engagement is all about looking at the body of knowledge which has developed and how I am going to contribute in that body of knowledge. So it is not simply about summarizing. So what as a researcher I try to do when I undertake review is I try to understand that what is the methodology adopted by the researcher, the author, what is the reason, rationale of adopting that methodology, and whether that is going to influence my research also or not. Because generally, when we do a kind of empirical research, we get tempted to follow a model which has already been followed by earlier researchers, and there's nothing wrong in following that model. But then the question comes in that when we follow that model, are we convinced that yes? And this conviction comes only when you undertake a thorough research. So the use of literature literature review is to support the problem statement. It is to clearly convey that there is a gap in previous research which your research is attempting to fulfill. Now, in that process, it may not happen that you would be attempting to fulfill all the gaps. You would not be fulfilling all the gaps. You would be certainly identifying only few gaps which you intend to fulfill, and then you can always the way we write that future scope of work and all. So it is, as I said, it is not about only referring to the previous research. It is more of summarizing and synthesizing. And this is something which is essence. And that's why it has been said that research will lose its value if literature review is absent. Why it will lose its value? Because it is through literature review we communicate to your reader that I am thorough with the topic and I know what I am doing. And it also helps you in avoiding plagiarism. If you do a review thoroughly, you would be not giving the references without identifying the same in the footnote. So good literature review also, as a researcher, contributes in a big way to all of us that our work is not plagiarized work. And it also enhances a research focus. As I said, it is about summarizing, it is about synthesizing, it is all about contextualizing. So if I say that it is about summarizing, synthesizing, contextualizing, you would agree with me that I am not referring to a sort of linear way of literature review. One way kind of, I decide the pathway and I keep on following. It is all about moving forward, then taking 2 steps back. So it is having, one can say it is having a multilinear approach. Literature review, somewhere demands a multilinear approach. Because summary is all about recapping the information. It is all about stating in a very simple word what the author intends, what the author had said. Synthesis is all about reorganization. It is all about reshuffling of that information. And that reshuffling, that reorganization may give a new meaning. And that's why we find, and in fact, which is not a very well-known phenomena in legal research, but you'd find that is something well established in social science research, that literature review alone gets published. We have been seeing that, social science, you make a good literature review, that itself gets published in good journal. Because literature review, as I said, good academic literature review is kind of, contribution to the knowledge base on its own. Generally, what we do when we do a legal research, we identify certain books, we read what is, we very summary, in very summary way we write that how do we, what is the, kind of scope of that book. We do not come up with the kind of idea that what is the idea underlying of that book. For example, I mean, it may not be a very good, perfect example, but something which can give us a kind of lead. Look at the book of Constitution authored by Professor M.P. Jain. Look at the book authored by Professor M.P. Singh, and look at the book authored by noted jurist Sirwai. Now you find all 3 books deal with Constitution, but their titles are different. Professor Singh's book known as Constitution of India. Professor M.P. Jain's book is known as Indian Constitutional Law. And Professor Sirwai's book is known as Constitutional Law of India. Whether this title convey the pattern of the discussion which these authors have followed. So this is what is a kind of reorganization, reshuffling of information which literature review demands. And when I say so, to substantiate it, you find in a book on Constitution of India authored by Professor Singh, it is provision-wise discussion, article-wise discussion. When you look at Indian Constitutional Law authored by Professor Jain, you would find it is a theme-wise discussion. Judiciary, Parliament, fundamental rights. When you look at Professor Sirwai, you would find that it is not only about what is there in the Constitution, also what should have been very critical approach. So this is something which we need to learn when we undertake the exercise of literature review. That it is not about summary. It is not only about saying that what is there in the book or in an article. It is all about, as I said, synthesizing, contextualizing, reorganizing. That is what is important. Is there any point? Someone, some colleague is making some point? No. Okay. Otherwise, if you have any point, you can make it. Okay. Let me proceed. So, one challenge we always come across is, before we write literature review, how shall we really identify that what all literature is to be reviewed? Because it is something like you are in midst of, abundance, and how to identify which is relevant. And that's a big challenge. And that's why it is suggested that while undertaking the exercise of review, it is advisable to be more patient, to have more patience. The reason being, you may come across a literature which you may find may not be very relevant. So that is a kind of, I would say, bottom line which we need to follow. So what you can keep in mind is that what sources are to be included. You need to be very careful in adopting sources. If it is a primary source, should it be a law commission report? Should it be it's a report of the other commissions? If it is purely an approach on, if it is study on judicial approach, what is the timeline you are adopting? Let's say, for example, if you want to study the approach of the judiciary on the plan of the government, timeline could be 2014 onwards, when we have seen majority government at the center, when one party is having majority. So 2014 timeline justifies. So that kind of preliminary exercise is needed. So that's why it is said that it is desirable to spend a lot of time on a literature review, because if you do it in a very comprehensive way by giving a lot of time, anyway you are going to use most of it in your dissertation, in your thesis, in your research work. So good literature review is about gathering information about a particular subject from many sources. So it is like diving deep into that area. And that is something which is important in order to avoid duplication. In order to avoid duplication, in order to establish communication with the other research which I have said, and also to give newness to your own research. And that's why it has been said that one of the important skill to be learned for reviewing the research is efficient time management. And efficient time management relates to my understanding is that how good you are in taking notes. It is suggested that take notes as you read it. Many of us are having the habit of writing in the text itself what we write. That is something which the practice we try to develop. Do not leave it for future to do it. Keep on taking notes. I mean, this is something which is very, very important. And if you do so, you can always identify what is relevant and not relevant. Otherwise, if you're not making notes, perhaps you may end up again, reviewing something which is not relevant at future stage of your research. Now, when I say review, and when I gave this example, it also connects with, while reading literature, what is needed is to think critically. Think that what author is trying to say. Is it relevant to my research which I have taken? If yes, then why it is relevant? And what is original about the author who is saying? Because this is also equally important, because generally what happens when you look at the research what we do, we end up identifying the sources which are repetitive in nature. There's nothing new which is coming out. And that makes the things little boring, I would put it. So it is also important that what is that new set of information which is coming out, which is original from the work what you are referring. So that's why it is said that review is not about reading and summarizing. Review is something where you give your input. Your input is important. It is your input which helps you in building your own idea, your own logic. And it is your input which gives that dimension. What is that? Summarizing, synthesizing, and contextualizing. This is something which is very vital and very significant for a good literature review. So, literature review might give a new interpretation of, it may bring in a new interpretation to old material, or it may trace the very intellectual progression of the field, or it may evaluate the sources and advise. It may evaluate the sources and advise the reader on what is pertinent. And when you conclude literature review, what is to be seen is whether it has identified the gap or not. So this is something which is a kind of analytical approach of literature review. I see there's some question in the chat box. Let me take it up. Priya is asking, for PhD thesis, should we have a chapter dedicated to review at the beginning, or the relevant review should be written before every chapter as per the question addressed by the chapter? It has to be at the beginning, because that is something which is the foundation of your research. What you are writing in the chapter is based on the gaps what you have identified after thorough review. So it has to be always, and that's why in a structure you find always it has to be, in the first chapter. Because it is only through literature review you are identifying the gap. Now, if your question relates to this, that you write the review at the beginning, and then again you have to write it again when you write the chapter, and whether it amounts to repetition or duplication, answer is no. Why answer is no? Because the approach is different. In literature review, you are just reading the literature for identifying the gap on the basis of which you have formulated your research objective. So purpose of literature review is that. Now in the chapter writing, you are referring to that literature in order to address that objective. So purpose is different. So if more than one reference is happening of the literature, it is something which is fine. There's nothing wrong in it. But it is the approach which should make a distinction. So that's why it is not desirable to have review at the beginning of each chapter. Review must be right at the beginning. That's why when you look at the research proposal, you always find reviews come before identification of research objective and research question, because that's how, and that is what is the significance of literature review. So what is the purpose of literature review? I'll put it this way, that it is all about placing my work as a researcher in a context in which the research has been taking place in that area. Purpose of literature review is to describe the relationship between my research and research of others. Purpose of literature review is to identify the innovativeness, the newness which my research would bring in. Purpose of literature review is to resolve the conflict which possibly has been visible in previous research. And most importantly, I would say, purpose of literature review is to prevent duplication. That would, to my understanding, is a very notable one. And that's why it has been said that every reference need not become part of literature review. It is not that whatever literature you are referring to, it should become part of literature review. If it is not connected with your research, it should not be. And that's why it is said that literature review is not about preparing bibliography. Literature review can certainly help you in preparing bibliography, but it is not to be equated with bibliography. That is something which is important to understand and take note of. Ideally, literature review is all about setting everything within a conceptual framework. You have built an idea, and then, I mean, this literature review is helping you in building that idea. It is helping you in establishing that conceptual framework. That's what we look at. So what shall be the strategy? Generate a list of reference, and then try to identify that how the references are relevant to the area which you have identified. And in this regard, it is always good to look at latest material. So the strategy should be define the boundaries, set the scope right at the beginning. So define the boundaries. When I say define the boundaries, as I said to you, one example I have given, it is all about, I do want to understand that how judiciary has responded on certain governmental action, and I want to see that how the judiciary has responded when there is a government which enjoys majority on the floor of the house. So I've defined the boundary. I've defined the boundary of 2014. That helps me in having a kind of control. That helps me in having a kind of control over what I need to look at while undertaking literature review. And this will also be important to ensure the reader that how the whole thing has progressed. No, when we go to the airport, we see a signpost, and without even asking anyone, we reach to our destination. The signpost helps us in reaching to the destination. this is something which is also very relevant when you talk about literature review. That you need to, through literature review, you need to communicate to the reader that what you aim to address in your research. So that signpost is important. And in this regard, and which connects with the question which again you are asking, that when we are writing literature review for a book, and if only 2 or 3 chapters are relevant to the research question, then should we contextualize that portion only? Yes, because what is important is to select only the most important points in each source to highlight in the review. That's why I'm saying review is different from what you write in the chapter. In the chapter you give, you analyze in detail. Here you are just identifying that key point, that why this literature is helping you in identifying the gap. Every literature may not help you in identifying the gap. Please also consider that fact. It is not about if you read a book on, let's say, Constitution of India, and if you read a book, by one author, and if you read another author books, it is going to give you any different, input. So no point quoting or identifying or writing 5 books just to establish that you have read 5 books. You can always give reference of these books when you're writing the chapters or in bibliography. But for the purpose of identifying the gaps, what you need to do is that what is that triggering factor which have I would put it in this way, what is the triggering factor which has made you to identify this gap? That is what needs to come in literature review. So select only the most important points in each source what you are referring to. And that's why it is suggested that choose the most relevant literature and remember to keep notes. That's what is important. In literature review, it is advisable to not to use any direct quotes. Direct quotes should not be used. It is true that in literature review, you are presenting others' ideas, but that presentation of other ideas should be in your own word, because there where you are contextualizing with your own research. If you are not bringing in your own word, if you are not at the front, then the purpose gets defeated. That is something which we need to keep in mind. And that's why it is such, that's why I said that it is time taking, because perhaps you may have to revise, revisit what you have written. So how to write literature review? As I said, all the details found in references should not become part of review. Only the findings of a reference is to be highlighted. Because if anyone wishes to read in detail, he can always refer to the reference what you are giving to. So if research is being taken for writing thesis, for writing, dissertation, it should be a comprehensive review. It is for, if it is for a journal article, it can be a selective review. And it is said for writing literature review, writing while you collect and collecting while you write. That helps you in presenting your thoughts in a very systematic manner. That addresses much of your concern when you progress with your research. So that aspect is to be kept in mind when you are identifying the reference and when you are identifying the key point. In literature review, as because your research is one integrated aspect, as it is, one integrated aspect, I would put it that there must be a thread running as if you are narrating the story. That is something which would make your literature review logical, which will make your literature review uh, informative, which will make your literature review persuasive, and which will also make the reading of literature review very pleasant. So when you're writing the review, keep in mind these aspects. Keep in mind these aspects. It's like correcting thread. Why certain references are coming? What is the sequencing you are following? What is the kind of learning which is coming from one to another one? That is desirable because it would help you in arriving at the logical conclusion. Logical conclusion? Logical conclusion of what? Not end of thesis. Logical conclusion of beginning of thesis. Beginning of thesis, that is something which is important. So, review would help you in maintaining the focus throughout the research, because it is expressed in the form of an assertion, I would say, or claim statement. So once you are very thorough with what you intend to do, your journey while undertaking research should be very smooth, because that will help you in remain focused. Not, there will be no deviation, and I would stress on this fact that in that process, if you come across with new discovery, you would not hesitate to acknowledge the same. That is also important. So the very process of identifying research gap is all about the insight what you are presenting, and on that insight you are deciding your own research process. And when we are doing so, I believe you would agree with me, you are in a way conversing with person of your own discipline. That's why when it comes to evaluation of research, we always look for the one who is well conversed in that area. Some tips to do a kind of literature search. Generally, it is said that look for the keywords and then go for identifying the literature in recent articles which is published in journal, and then look at the references which are published in the journal, and then draw a reference from there. I mean, pick the references from there. This is something which can help us in I mean, if that is something which will also helps in facilitating the whole process and in identifying the whole process and carrying out the research without having this kind of fear in mind that whether it's going to be a new work, new interpretation, or it's going to have a kind of repetitive work. So this is something which we keep in mind. I'm not getting into the question of what shall we look for when it comes to sources of literature. It is well known. I believe I'm talking to faculty colleagues, and they have got a rich experience in doing so. So I'll just highlight on format of literature review, that what could be a format. There's nothing hard and fast with regard to format, but this is something which one can keep in mind. One is, we say, chronological literature review, which describes each work in succession, starting with the earliest available information. This is very traditional and all of us are very used to of this. The only thing is that when we undertake this kind of format, what is desirable is that you need to group together the sources in order of their publication. So what is the timeline you're looking for? Perhaps within that timeline you can think of, like, generally we find, though sometime I get puzzled also with that approach, many research and thesis when it comes for evaluation, you find it has been clubbed as position available in ancient India, and in ancient India the study goes back to Vedas. Then in medieval India it relates to Mughal period and all, and then in modern period. Now, as a researcher, we generally get puzzled that what is this timeline we are fixing? What is the timeline which we are looking at? If you want to study constitutional development, I think a study on ancient India is of no relevance, unless and until you are picking certain philosophy, and that philosophy you want to connect with cultural perspective. So that we need to be very clear. So timeline could be one way of looking at it. Then you have thematic literature review, where as a researcher I organize my literature review based on theme. Different theme I pick up. For example, if I am doing a research on AI and law, I shall be discussing the relevance of AI in solving problem of human society, how the law shall regulate the technological intervention. All this becomes point of discussion. So there can be a different theme on which we can look at it. So there could be a traditional review where we analyze and summarize. There could be a systematic review. There could be an argumentative review where you present the argument, where we selectively identify the literature in order to support an argument or refute an argument. When we talk about systematic review, this is all about focusing on some empirical question which we want to take up. Then we also have a descriptive review where we describe the work. So review is of many kinds. It is for us to understand that how do we take up the review. And also important to take note that review is not about abstract. Review differs from abstract. So sometimes when we write review, we write in a form of abstract. We know very well abstract is all about condensing the information and presenting it. Review, as I said, is not about condensing the information. As I said, it is more of the whole process where condensing is happening, synthesis is happening, contextualization is happening. So to sum up, literature review serves the purpose of educating oneself as a researcher, how I am fully conversed with the area. Literature review helps me in understanding and shaping my argument. It helps me in justifying my scope of work. It provides background and the justification. It is like reverse pyramid, where you identify, critically discuss, then identify the gap, and then research question. Good literature review would demand that literature review should be considered as a project in itself. But at the same time, there is a caution. What is the caution? Keep focus on your research, not on literature review. Otherwise, you'll get lost. So always focus on your research, not on literature. Good research is good because it advances our collective understanding. And to advance our collective understanding, a researcher needs to understand what has been done before, the strength and weaknesses of the study which has been done earlier. So as a good researcher, I cannot perform a significant research unless and until I have a kind of understanding of the literature which exists. So if I am not thorough with review, I believe I'll be in a disadvantageous position. Thank you very much. I believe there is one or two questions. I'll take it in the chat box. Is there any mandate by UGC that literature to be subjected for review needs to be the latest one? Whether the researchers are permitted to use the literatures of ancient times? Your prerogative. I don't think any regulatory body would mandate on this. And if there is any mandate, we have every right as a researcher to challenge it. Research is something which I have to own. Let us not go by the mandate. Let us go by the requirement. Then what is the requirement of research? I would put it this way. There's another question. I don't know if Dr. Santhu Pal is a former student and colleague of mine. Thanks for asking this question, Santanu. Kindly guide as to what should be the content that we can insert while drafting an exclusive syllabus for review of literature, which has to be taught as master level, because there is a confusion that it sometimes overlaps with research methodology. Review is certainly part of methodology. Let us not get confused with that. But then can review be a separate subject? Answer is yes. I'm telling you, format of review, could be part of the content. I'm telling you, the strategy could be part of the content. How the review differs from writing other, academic writing could be part of content. All this can be a part of content and certainly become a standalone subject to be offered at the master level. That's the only question I see in the chat box. If there are any, I'll take it up. And I thank the organizer, I thank Madam and the MG University for giving this opportunity.